All right. I would like to hear from the LAO.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ashley Ames with the Analyst's Office. I see that you have the handout that we prepared, and I'll refer to that in the testimony. I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the beverage container recycling program, or sometimes referred to as the bottle bill. And so first, I'm going to discuss quickly the program's background, its creation and goals, and how it works. Then I'll talk about the program's success in terms of increased recycling and litter abatement. Next, I'll outline the program's expenditures and provide some information on the finances and the current structural deficit, and then finally give our analysis of the proposal that's included in the budget this year. The program itself was established almost 30 years ago, and it was intended to reduce the beverage container component of litter and achieve a recycling rate of 80% for containers that are in the program. It's a self-funding program that encourages consumers to return the containers by first requiring them to pay a deposit on eligible containers that are purchased, and then guaranteeing repayment of that deposit when the container is returned to a recycler. So if you look at the first figure on page 1, you can see how containers are determined, whether they're eligible to be in the program or not. To be included, a beverage must be ready to consume, so not a concentrate or mix, made from one of the materials in the program, so glass, plastic, or aluminum, less than 64 ounces, and not one of the exceptions. So examples of beverages that are in the program would be bottles and cans of soda and beer, plastic water bottles, and fruit and tea drinks. If a container is part of the program, as I mentioned, consumers pay a deposit when they purchase that beverage. That's the California Redemption Value, or CRV. If you turn to page 2, you can see how containers and CRV payments are exchanged under the program. The amount of the CRV currently is 5 or 10 cents, depending on the size of the container. And I won't go into a lot of detail on the different participants, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have on that page. If you look to page 3, you can see that the program has been successful at increasing the recycling of these containers. When it began, the recycling rate was about 52%, and it has risen to around 85% in recent years. We note that it's fluctuated over the years, though, due to the CRV amount, which containers are included in the program, and other factors. We also note that recycling today is slightly lower, around 82%, probably at least in part because of some measures taken by CalRecycle to reduce fraud in the program, such as limiting the number of containers that someone can redeem at a recycling center at any one time. Since the program began, the total number of containers recycled has actually tripled, and that's due to the higher recycling rate as well as program expansion, such as the addition of bottled water in 2000. It's less clear how the program has affected litter, but because containers that are recycled can't be littered, it seems likely that it's at least reduced the beverage component of litter. However, there haven't been any recent studies. And turning to page 4, this page outlines the expenditures from the program's beverage container recycling fund. And so when containers are not redeemed, the state keeps these unclaimed deposits that was paid on them, and that money is used to support recycling-related supplemental programs. So many of these activities and funding amounts are actually in statute. They do things like encourage recyclers to locate in convenient places, provide recycling grants, and support local recycling programs, reduce the financial burden on beverage manufacturers, and cover program administration. Because these activities are funded with unclaimed CRV, when the recycling rate increases, and therefore more CRV is paid out on redeemed containers, there's less money for them. So that leads us to the deficit, which on page 5, yes. Due to the higher recycling rates as well as these expenditures on the supplemental programs, the fund has been operating in a structural deficit for quite some time. The department projects that the deficit will be around $75 million over the next few years. We know that there was a proposal to address the deficit as part of the 2014-2015 budget package, but ultimately did not pass. So the deficit is still ongoing and will need to be addressed at some point in the future to avoid across-the-board cuts for the supported programs, which is what is currently required under state law should the fund be depleted. And then finally, on page 6, we have this year's budget proposal Mr. Smithline already described. We do find that the proposal is a reasonable way to address the issues that were identified by the state auditor, but we have more fundamental concerns regarding the effectiveness of the program itself that the budget proposal does not address. So first, we find that the program structure is problematic because the payments are calculated based on a jurisdiction's population rather than any type of performance criteria that indicate potential success. It's unlikely to result in the most cost-effective mix of recycling and litter reduction activities. Unlike other fund allocation methods, such as competitive grants, ineffective programs under this model are just as likely to be funded as effective ones. And we also note that there is another supplemental program that does provide competitive grants to local governments for recycling-related activities.
There's another program, you said?
Yes, there's a competitive grant program for the local governments that they can also apply for funding.
Okay. Administered through the department?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, as part of this beverage container recycling program.
Okay.
And then secondly, we find that the effectiveness of the program is unclear, and that's a result of a lack of outcome metrics that could indicate the success of the program in meeting the goals of the BCRP. And so while we acknowledge the department is seeking resources to improve program oversight and accountability, the additional activities proposed don't actually measure program effectiveness and are focused more on providing oversight of the expenditures. And so therefore, based on those findings, we do recommend that the legislature eliminate the city-county payment program because of the concerns with the structure and the lack of information on effectiveness. And moreover, that would provide $10.5 million in savings to the fund, which is about 14%, or would reduce the structural deficit by about 14%. And so that concludes my comments on this, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I have some questions. How about you, Senator Nielsen? Any questions? Your recommendation, has there been an effort over the past years to do something about this effectiveness issue, since that seems to be the thrust of your concern?
We did recommend, we did an analysis last year where we issued a report on the program, and several of the supplemental programs don't have clear measurements in terms of their success based on their ability to increase recycling rates or reduce litter. And so that was one of our recommendations at that time, was to evaluate all of those programs as well as this one.
And Mr. Smithline, what do you think about that, her comments?
Well, first of all, thank you for that very good overview of the program. She raised a number of really key points that we agree with, frankly. With respect to the city-county payment program, we think it makes more sense. While we do agree that there is opportunities to reform and improve that program, we think it makes more sense to do it in a broader reform context. We agree that a number of the mandatory payments in this program could benefit from an overview to make sure that the consumer is really getting their benefit from those programs. We made many of those recommendations in the 14-15 BCP, and we still think that many of those alterations would be beneficial to the program. It's just that it doesn't necessarily make sense procedurally to start changing them one at a time. So we would prefer to do that in a broader context.
Okay. Staff raises the issue whether there ought to be some kind of panel that should do what you're doing, what you suggest, that should sort of take a view of, a holistic view of these programs and make recommendations to moving forward.
Specifically with respect to the beverage container program?
The overall recycling programs.
All the programs within the department?
Just recycling.
Okay. So,
I don't know.
you know, we have...
There are no recommendations today. This
Understood.
is held open. But
Understood. Historically, we have been a board, so there was that structure at one point in time. There's obviously pros and cons to that structure, as has been discussed previously in this hearing today. We have continued the legacy of transparency to the best of our ability. We continue to hold monthly meetings They're not board meetings, they're monthly departmental meetings, but we go through the same agenda that any items that would be approved then by me or by delegated to the deputies, we go through those items. We have a very transparent approach with respect to all of our regulations. We start all our regulations with an informal regulatory process that often goes 1 or 2 years before we even begin a formal regulatory process to make sure all the stakeholders have an opportunity to become aware of the issues. So I'd say I'm very proud of our continued approach on transparency.
All right. All right, we are holding this open. Are there any, Senator Nielsen?
Chair Walk, I just have to observe, and I've kind of watched it a few years since I've been back, since 2008, but I go way back to the genesis of the recycling issue. And that dates to the late 70s. There were many bills over the years related to recycling. And it seems like over the years it's been changed, reformed, refined, and it seems more of late, and that would be in more recent years. Things are starting to be done in the budget instead of major policy bills. And I consider these not just little fine-tuning things, these are fairly significant. And I would rather that the administration be dealing more up front with them in policy and statutes. This is not some minor stuff. Look how many people are here today. This is not a policy hearing, and I'd rather see that we had greater opportunity for the public to be involved. So I'm sort of complaining that we need to do these things in statutes and not trailer bills. This is kind of a general problem I have, but I have it specifically with this area as well.
All right, is there any public comment on this item? We are holding this open. Any public comment? Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair and Senators. My name is Susan Collins. I'm from the Container Recycling Institute, and my comments are related to financial matters. So basically, in 2 issues, number 1, we need more and better financial information about this program. The program does, or CalRecycle does produce quarterly financial reports, but they're not always quarterly. They need to be timely, accurate, and complete. And we've had issues that we've shared with CalRecycle about all of those, timely, accurate, complete. In addition to that, 2 years ago, and this is on the subject of revenue collection, 2 years ago, this committee approved 5 new positions for CalRecycle in their auditing group to address a serious concern that millions of dollars in revenues were not being collected each year. CalRecycle at the time estimated it in one document as maybe $2.5 million a year additional that could be collected. In another document, it was maybe $23 million a year that could be collected. Our independent analysis is that it could be as much as $200 million that could be collected. Regardless of what the estimate is, both CalRecycle and the Container Recycling Institute agree that this is a serious issue. It needs to be addressed, and that's why CalRecycle requested these 5 additional auditing positions. However, they haven't been filled. I'm not sure if 2 of them have been filled or 3 of them have been filled, but I know that the net number of auditors has gone from, I think it was 13 to 14, and the total number of audits that were completed actually went down in the year after the positions were requested. So our recommendation, our request is that to correct this situation, these actions need to be completed, the positions need to be filled, the audits need to be completed, and the results should be reported publicly, including to this committee.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, please. Welcome.
Madam Chair, Member Ralph Simone, representing the California and Nevada Beverage Association. I want to touch upon 2 points. One is the structural insolvency, and the other is the sort of global commodity prices that have impacted the program. As to the structural insolvency, I went back and looked at my notes from 2 years ago when there was a very aggressive BCP from the department that made numerous programmatic changes. And one of the things that struck me was the urgency for that BCP was an insolvency date that was March of 2016. That was last month. Now, in the latest quarterly report, that insolvency date is March of 2018. Now, I'm not saying this to be critical of the department per se. It's a very complex program with an incredible number of moving parts. My point is more, before we make aggressive policy changes, we really need to take the time to reflect and go through it. As a matter of fact, the last report, or excuse me, prior to the last quarterly report of the department, the structural insolvency was pegged at 26 million. Then all of a sudden, the most recent was up to 76. And one minor projection in that report, which was an 7% increase in the recycling rate of PET, could make about a $40 million difference in the ultimate amount. Quick comment on the commodity prices. You know, you've all been aware and probably have heard from your districts that there's been a contraction in the convenience zone servicing out there. A lot of this has had to do with global commodity pricing. Aluminum is down like 28%. PET is down around 46%, and this profit has been basically taken away from those recyclers out there. And these are mega issues that we've never contended with before, a long trough, sustained trough. On the positive side, I want to compliment the department. They have held numerous workshops where they've dissected every component of this program, provided a lot of valuable information to stakeholders. As a result, there are stakeholder meetings that are ongoing. Hopefully, we will have something for policy committees to consider at some point. I don't know exactly when. One of the core concepts that people seem to be gravitating toward is what we loosely would call a differential, which is keep the deposit at a nickel, but look for a lower amount to pay out to the consumers, because ultimately there is a cost to recycling in all of the programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, please. Welcome.
Hi, Mike Robson here on behalf of the Glass Packaging Institute. I was going to break up my comments into three quick parts, and one it kind of was hit on by the previous two speakers, just on the condition of the fund, and before we make big policy decisions, to really get a handle on the condition of the fund. As Mr. Simone noted, there's been the deficit in the fund was declining and then just shot up. There's been some delays in quarter reports, and as Ms. Collins noted, there's probably if there's the right auditing staff and so on, we could probably get a better handle on the finances and make sure that any changes we make are commensurate with the deficit, the actual deficit. Just on some of the reforms of supplemental payments, typically, and one of the reforms that Mr. Smithline referenced previously had been processing fee offsets and eliminating the processing fee offsets or declining the processing fee offsets, phasing them out. Just speaking for the glass industry, I just want to, we resist that. The glass industry, the offset's important to the glass container industry, and to the degree that costs of a glass bottle go up in a global marketplace for containers, beverage manufacturers will turn to containers that are less environmentally friendly than a glass container. Glass containers are 100% recyclable, made from sand and recycled material. We could find containers we could find beverages going into containers that aren't even in the program today, so that are not environmentally friendly, and so that's a consequence, and so we'd like to protect our offset. But to the degree, and the consultant, to her credit, makes note on page 31 of your analysis, some ideas, and talks about greenhouse gas reduction fund, and I could just, speaking for the glass industry, there is a direct nexus between the glass container manufacturing and this program, and that for every 6 tons of recycled glass, there's a 1 ton reduction of GHG emissions, and if you needed our processing fee offset and you wanted to plug in the processing fee offset account with GGRF money, that is as perfectly logical and is a nexus. So
Okay, thank you. Next, please.
Madam Chair and members, Erin Niemela representing Replanet Recycling. Replanet is the largest convenience zone operator in the state. And in the past couple of months, you've probably heard we've closed about 200 centers, in addition to a lot of centers last year. Some of the other players in the marketplace cumulatively closed another 130. So all told, your convenience centers are down by about 25% of where they were. Convenience centers get 60% of the customers in this program. So if your convenience centers go down, then your recycling rate will ultimately follow. And that's a big concern for us. And as you also probably know from your local grocers, this also creates a threat that they will end up taking this product back into their stores, which I don't think any of us want. I do want to just point out a couple of things. For Replanet, I think the biggest assists right now would be maintaining the recycling infrastructure, and that comes at a cost. That cost will contribute to the structural deficit this program already has. So we would ask that handling fee rates be frozen as of July 1st, and we would ask that the prior processing payments return. So that's the December 2015 level. That is part of why we closed so many centers, and we suspect part of why our competitors closed so many centers this past year. The second thing I just want to point out is sort of in response to some of the testimony you've heard today. In the old days, we would have called some of the discrepancies budget dust. I'm not suggesting for a minute that discrepancies shouldn't be overlooked. I am simply saying we have a not debatable structural deficit in this program. And we can't overlook that in the discussion about nickels and dimes. What we are proposing, what we think you need to maintain your recycling infrastructure will contribute to that structural deficit. And so I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost in this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And last but never least, Mr. Murray.
Thank you for saying that. Mark Murray with the environmental group Californians Against Waste. I think that some of our comments with this diversity of speakers are going to sound similar because we actually have been talking. So I want to assure you that we are talking to try and come up with a solution. But just maybe a couple of overview comments. We're talking about right now $75 million in structural deficit, but as was just pointed out, we've got an additional problem caused by global change in scrap prices, which has caused a loss of hundreds, literally hundreds of recycling centers in the state, particularly in Northern California. And that solving that problem is going to take some additional money. So we are going to, in order to solve that, we need to put some additional money into recycling center funding. And frankly, we need to do that by July 1st. We don't necessarily have to solve the structural deficit by July 1st, but I think that the department and the administration are looking for some assurances that in spending more money effective July 1st, we have a plan for eliminating the structural deficit. And so I think that this process may be our best bet in terms of the budget process for making these fixes effective July 1st. The problem, just again, it's lots of recycling centers closed and a mandate on grocery stores right now, some 2,000 dealers, beverage dealers in the state that are having to take containers back inside the store. In the old days, that wasn't a half bad idea when you were just taking a six-pack, but it's not really the way that we recycle in California, and I would have to concur that it's a bit of a burden. I think that having full-service recycling centers in our communities would be a better way to go, and again, it's going to take some more money. I do want to point out, it was referenced in terms of the March 2 years ago or where we were with the deficit. At that point in time, the department was talking about a $175 million deficit. And to their credit, they have implemented administrative reforms across the board that have reduced the size of that structural deficit. As was also pointed out, last year in their quarterly reports, we thought it was going to be a $26 million deficit. But again, we had a singular change in recycling rate. One container type, PET plastic containers, went from 70% to 78%, and that singular change cost the fund $45 million. It's a good thing that we recycled all those additional plastic containers, but it did cost the fund $45 million that wasn't in the fall projections. So that's why those numbers change. Now, the bottom line in terms of what's the source of this cost in this cost gap, it is the net cost to recycling glass containers, about $55 million, and the net cost to recycling plastic containers, about $30 million. So somehow, the producers and consumers of those containers are going to have to pay more money. That's the only way to solve this problem. There's no other magic box to get this money from. And I don't think that this is a time when we should be cutting recycling expenditures. Instead, I think we need to do is figure out what is the path of least resistance for getting the beverage industry to pay their fair share. And that fair share is different for each container type, and that's why we have these differential payments. But I do think that there's opportunity to come up with an agreement that will move us in the direction we're talking with glass, beer, soft drink, plastic. We are talking, I do want to point out that on the local government, the staff and LAO have done a great job of summarizing this very complicated program. Just one little item on the local government program, and this is a secret, so I have to say it quietly. So that $10 million, it does provide us with some leverage with local governments. We need the local governments to be partners in the siting of the supermarket-based recycling centers. And some of those local governments aren't really keen on having those recycling centers, and we do and can use that $10 million as leverage to keep those recycling centers open, to have them work with us in terms of making sure we have those full-service recycling opportunities. So for that reason, we would like to keep that, although I think that it can be reformed, and I think that the administration's proposal will help us do that. So
All right.
Thank you for your time. We're going to need a little bit more of your time, though, over the next couple of weeks on this.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Well, you have that. We will hold this open. Mr. Smithline, would you like to say anything in conclusion?
Again, thank you for the opportunity. I think the stakeholders actually did a really good job of summarizing all the main points. I was going to go through those points. I think they've done a good job of doing that, so I think you're well informed.
All right. Thank you. Any comments from any member? All right. And we
Did
have,
anyone bring up, it was a big issue a couple of years ago about out-of-state people bringing in indoor markets as part of it? If you already covered it, that's fine.
I didn't cover it. If you want, I can just briefly address
It's just
that.
have we been able to reduce that number, I guess, is it?
So it's difficult to know what that number is, obviously, because it's unknown. It's criminal activity. So it's difficult to surmise what that exact number is. We have new programs in place to address it, though. We have new relationships with CDFA, and there's a new requirement on the importation of beverage containers in the state that requires those importing used beverage containers to go through a border station, and they're required to report on the volumes of the materials that they're taking in. We have received, I think, over 10,000 or so of those, what we call IMRs, imported material reports. We're going and analyzing those now, but we've already seen that that's had an impact. Through discussions with the recyclers, we know that that's had an impact on the importation and the criminal activity. We've also seen an increase in arrests and prosecutions with respect to those. So there is activity.
That was part of the structural deficit problem still, us paying.
I believe that's both the implementation of the IMRs as well as some of the other reforms that we implemented are one of the, those are some of the items that bought us some time, if you will, from that earlier concern about hitting proportional reductions to where we are now.
all right. So we have completed that item. We have one item open. So thank you very much. We have one item open, Fran, and that is
Low
page
carbon.
21, low
Yep.
carbon.
Yep.
The recommendation
Sorry, I missed that.
was to reject the proposal.
Yes, and that would be consistent with the assembly, is that correct? Okay, I'll move.
It's been moved.
Okay.
And please call the roll, or open the roll.
Senator Walk?
I think we already voted.
We're voting aye on rejecting, right?
Yes, we are.
Just want to make sure.
It's 2-0.
Senator Pavley?
Aye.
So 3-0, that item is rejected. That proposal is rejected. All right, I think that's it, unless we missed something along the way.
EEI.
Oh, gosh, I know.
Page 30.
And the most important item of the day, the Education and Environment Initiative. I'm glad you didn't leave.
Still here.
Right. Page 32.
Thank you. So within our department is the Office of Education and the Environment, and within that is EEI, The Education and the Environment Initiative dates back to 2003, as I think you well know. The idea is to incorporate environmental principles into the core curriculum of K-12 education. This is a request for $700,000 to address the increase in demand for this product, as well as to develop a sustainable funding strategy to be able to bridge the gap. We're back ordered on these materials, so we want the opportunity to develop a strategy to bridge the gap between now and when this material will be incorporated into the curriculum of textbooks.
Mm-hmm. All right, comments? Senator Nielsen?
Well, this is going to change my point of view a little bit. This interpretation by administration that because it got a 2/3 vote, that, you know, this now gives grounds for being a tax increase. If Republicans are going to have their 2/3 vote on a bill prospectively be interpreted as a vote for a tax increase, we're going to have to take another look at how we're going to consider 2/3 votes. You know, that it was a fee that was considered, and there was not enough objection, you know, to the fee. But now that's going to morph into being viewed as a tax in the future. And I'm going to be reminding my Republican colleagues that maybe we don't want to be putting votes up if that's the way it's going to be interpreted in the future.
All right, we have a motion to approve as proposed, plus $780,000 additional funding for printing, and I believe the governor requests that that come from the Used Oil Recycling Fund partially and the Tire Recycling Management Fund. And this is for the environmental curriculum, the environmental initiative program. So, is there a motion?
So move.
It's been moved.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Andrew Holt, Department of Finance. For the record, we'd just like to note our concern with the additional augmentation and note that the curriculum has been developed and is available online.
All right, thank you for your concern. We have a motion to approve as proposed, plus additional funding for printing. Please call the roll.
Senator Wolk?
Aye.
Senator Nielsen?
No.
Senator Pavley?
Aye.
2-1, that proposal is approved. All right, now I believe we're complete. All right, we are adjourned.